It's like, imagine if China came to Cuba and was like, hey, we're going to help you militarize the Gulf of Mexico against the US. How would the New York Times act about that? And how would the US respond?
If there's a rogue nation on earth, it's the United States. If there's a country, and of course, Israel, as we see so clearly these days, these are the countries that cause war. These are the countries that invade other countries, take over other people's territory, and they, and the United States at least doesn't do it very well. Defeated in Afghanistan, defeated basically in Iraq, leaving behind these dysfunctional societies like the sad situation in Libya these days, not determining any responsibility for the lives of other people, but simply destroying things that they see as antithetical to their interests. Whereas China's big aggressive campaign is to go out and help countries around the world build economic infrastructure. It's just the cognitive dissonance, the doublethink that imperialism foists upon us every single day is just astonishing.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. With the U.S.-Israeli genocide in Gaza capturing our attention, it's easy to forget the U.S. Cold War on China has continued to escalate. Before October 7th, the corporate media was saber-rattling about the South China Sea, saying that China is militarizing international waters, and it's a major threat to U.S. allies like the Philippines. This is used as justification for the already existing U.S. militarization and aggression in the South China Sea that's seen as a potential powder keg, even more than Taiwan. The mainstream Cold War narrative states that U.S. militarization is a defensive posture in response to Chinese belligerence, completely erasing the U.S. centuries-long imperialist project of maintaining military hegemony and economic dominance over the Indo-Pacific. So who's really the aggressor? Is it China that's causing problems, or is it the U.S.? How have the geopolitical shifts post-October 7th impacted the U.S. Cold War on China and the world's response to it? And where does China fit in when it comes to the issue of Palestine? Joining me to discuss this is Ken Hammond, a professor of history at New Mexico State University and author of China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future, published by 1804 Books. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full episode is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Ken, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you on.
Always glad to be here.
Well, there's obviously a lot to talk about here. I want to get into the South China Sea and U.S. militarism in that part of the world and the ongoing Cold War with China. But first, given the chaotic nature of what's happening in the world right now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of geopolitical shifts we've seen since October 7th and China's role in some of that, or maybe changing role in the world. And where I'll start from there is, when it comes to the issue of Palestine, as we're witnessing this horrific genocide unfold, we're now 7 months into it. What has been the Chinese role during all of this, and how does China relate to the issue of Palestine?
Well, China's position has always been to give strong support to the people of Palestine, for their fight for their rights, for their recovery of their homeland. China has supported that politically with both just statements and support, rhetorical support, I suppose you might say, but also at the United Nations and in other international bodies. And China, of course, has been more active in recent years in working with nations across the Islamic world to try to bring people together, to try to overcome some of the contradictions that have been out there. Of course, we had their brokering of a bit, at least, of a reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and we've just seen China in the present moment be very clear, very consistent that the Palestinian people have a right to exist. They have a right to their homeland, and they have the right to be left unmolested, certainly, by the IDF and the state of Israel. So I think that China's made their position very, very clear, and it's been a very, very consistent one.
Yeah, I was quite impressed to see maybe like a couple months ago at this point, we had the Chinese representative at the UN state very clearly Palestinians have the inalienable right to use of force to resist oppression. So essentially saying the right to armed resistance is completely legitimate. I think that was maybe, I could be wrong, but at least in modern times, I think that was a first from China. So that was interesting. And I think it's really important what you say about the mediating role, in the sense that in this moment, China did mediate the peace deal, the normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and having those two countries not be fighting each other the way they were through proxies across the region, at least let's say like they were 10 years ago. And especially in this moment where they even, they've had repeated meetings all throughout the past 7 months and even before, has led to more stability across the region, which I know sounds a little bit silly to say when we're watching a genocide unfold in Gaza, but that's because of what Israel's doing.
Right. Exactly.
And Saudi Arabia hasn't been as malicious as an actor because it's not viewing everything through the prism of a war on Iran like it was before. So that's been really important. And, I also do want to point out that I interviewed an official from the Ansar Allah, which is known in the U.S. as the Houthi movement in Yemen. And I actually asked what his views were on China sending some naval ships to the Red Sea. And he told me, we don't see China as a threat at all. They're not here like in a threatening way, not the way the US is. So I do think that that's interesting. Like China's role in the region it can be quite neutral because they, want stability. And so there will be criticisms that China isn't doing enough. And I am curious what you think about that. But at the same time, overall, China isn't causing problems, is how I would put it.
Yeah, I think, China's foreign policy, China's international relations for basically as long as the People's Republic has been here, have been based upon these what are called the five principles, the ideas, which basically argue that international relations should be conducted on a basis of mutual benefit, mutual respect, and most importantly, and the Chinese emphasize this over and over, is respect for the territorial integrity and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. So that can lead, as you I think quite correctly observed, to some people being critical of China, saying they're not doing enough. And I think that certainly in this present context, where the state of Israel is just conducting this horrific genocidal campaign. We would all like to see, any party, any country that could intervene in some more forceful way to try to back the Israelis off. But that's not, doesn't have bases in the area. It doesn't have a military presence in the area. Their role is essentially diplomatic and political. I'm sure that they're exerting as much pressure as they can behind the scenes on Israel, but the Netanyahu government doesn't seem to be responsive to anything except its own sort of fascist mentality. So I think that China's done what it can. And I think that, that as a force for stability, as a very consistent voice, supporting, the Palestinian people, not giving in to this idea that all of this began October 7th when Hamas launched this terrible offensive, but seeing it as part of this, 70 plus years of oppression and exploitation and, just terrible treatment by Israel of the Palestinian people, that the events of October 7th, are a legitimate expression of the right of resistance to oppression. And I think China's position on that, not only at the United Nations, but in their foreign, the foreign ministry statements and all that, has been just really better than almost anybody else in the world.
I also do wonder how much, and I'm not in the room with Chinese officials who plan out policy, and I know you aren't either, but you do know China. So I do wonder how much watching the U.S. unwaveringly back just the most horrible things that I think we've seen in this century in Gaza. I think completely unprecedented, just like the complete dismantling of hospitals and summarily executing doctors and patients and throwing people into mass graves and killing journalists. And I mean, I could go on and on about the horrors in Gaza. It would take a whole episode and longer to do that. But seeing what the US is willing to condone and be partner to, I do wonder if, not that countries were under any illusions over like what the US is capable of and how far they're willing to go, but I do wonder if there's a level of like, it's kind of frightening. Like it's a frightening thing to see how far Western imperialism is willing to go to get its way. And if that maybe changes the calculation of countries in determining, I mean, China's always been very cautious, right? It doesn't want war, but I wonder if this maybe even causes like more caution, because you don't want to poke a psychotic person in the case.
Well, I think that's a very good point. That you know the extent to which American imperialism is willing to go in terms of just continuing to pour billions and billions and billions of dollars into the funding of the IDF and the supply of war materials and weapons and all this, in the face of universal condemnation by most other countries in the world, by most people in the world, and by significant numbers of people here in the United States. The Biden administration, which, as we know, is just mired in its old Cold War ideology everywhere in the world. Certainly, its engagement, it's continuing to pursue the war, the proxy war in Ukraine. It's ramping up of contradictions over Taiwan in the South China Sea, all those kinds of things. We're used to that. We see that. We understand that's what American imperialism does. But the genocide taking place in Gaza and the occupied territories, it's just it kind of does take it to a new level. And I think that it is certainly something that countries that are engaged in, shall we say, just tense relationships with the United States need to take seriously. That the warmongering rhetoric that we hear coming out of Congress and the White House and the mainstream media towards China is not something that we should just sort of slough off and say, oh, that's just political posturing. It is political posturing, but it's political posturing that has very, very dangerous implications. It's reckless, and it can blow up in a way that we see the United States is willing to stand by, not just stand by idly, but to actively contribute to a situation in which now more than 35,000 civilians have been murdered by the IDF. And the United States is like, lots of crocodile tears and hand-wringing about humanitarianism, but continuing to just keep the floodgates open.
Yeah. And then, I thought it was really interesting. At the end of April, the Chinese hosted these discussions between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas,
yes,
to discuss potential reconciliation. I thought that was really interesting. It's kind of the first I've seen China, and I could be wrong, but I hadn't seen before China really involve itself in trying to, mediate between Palestinian factions. But I think that's kind of an extension of what it did between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and just speaks to the potential mediating role. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, but also moreover, before we kind of move on from the Israel-Palestine dynamic, I wanted to also ask you about the idea of, Israel as a U.S. military base, which it is. Israel is this massive U.S. military base in the Middle East, in West Asia, and how that may be relevant to a future Cold War with China.
Yeah, well, those are two important issues. I was very impressed with the efforts that China has undertaken to look down the road, to say we have this horrible situation going on, but presumably at some point, in one way or another, it will come to an end, whether that's through the collective force of popular resistance and the opposition of people around the world and their governments, or who knows how it's going to eventually play out. But at some point, there has to be a future for Palestine. There has to be a future for Gaza and for the people living in the occupied territories. And that future has to be bound up with political leadership amongst the Palestinian people. The idea that, Netanyahu has got this idea that somehow what they're doing is going to eradicate Hamas or something is just it's so patently absurd. We know from history that these kinds of efforts to exterminate people and oppress and obliterate their political leadership, all that does is reinforce their determination to resist. And we see that with the Palestinian people. We see that with the authority, with Hamas. So I think China's efforts to try to say, look, down the road, what are we going to do? How are we going to put this back together? How can the Palestinian people craft a unified political system that's going to allow them to have their own state and to undertake this massive, massive work of rebuilding. I mean, all the destruction, not just the murder of people, but the destruction of infrastructure, housing, hospitals, all these things, schools, all these things that we've seen. That's going to have to be rebuilt. And how's that going to happen? I can't imagine. I don't think anybody in the world takes seriously the idea that Israel's going to do anything about that.
Right.
The United States may make some minor gestures, the supposedly building this pier to deliver humanitarian aid. What has that actually amounted to? So someone is going to have to help these people, to get back on their feet. And I think that overcoming the contradictions and they're real contradictions, they're substantive issues between the authority and Hamas and other political participants. But to try to take positive steps to build a better future, already thinking about it at this point, I think that's a sign of China's sort of political maturity and vision and their not just willingness, but their desire to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem like the United States.
And then the issue of just Israel as a military base and a potential like how that might be used in some sort of future war with China. And I'm just curious if the Chinese see it that way, because Israel's such a proxy of the US. And I think someone recently pointed out to me, it was Richard Becker, who I had on my show last week. He made the point that Israel as a military base has a lot of uses for America, not just in the region, it always has around the world. And as the U.S. looks to great power competition, it certainly plays a role in that, even if Israel happens to have some sort of trade relationship with China.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Chinese certainly recognize the role that Israel plays as a component of America's sort of global imperialist infrastructure. I'm not sure, specifically in terms of the flashpoints of conflict. Potential conflict with China, which I think are likely to be South China Sea or, the Taiwan Strait, but could also be, we know that the United States in the past has infiltrated terrorist activists into Tibet. We know that, they're capable certainly of doing that in Xinjiang and other areas. And of course, they've launched these, color revolution subversion campaigns in Hong Kong. There's a number of areas in which conflict with China could get ramped up by the United States. And the use of Israel's proximity to the Red Sea, of course, that's a shipping channel which right now, interestingly enough, the Chinese can continue to use because their relationship with the movement in Yemen is a very positive one. And they're viewed by people, I think, across the Islamic world as playing a very positive role in the Middle East. But Israel could just as easily decide that it was going to interdict trade in the Red Sea, and that would be something which could be potentially difficult for the Chinese. So I think it's not clear exactly what kind of a role Israel would play in that, but certainly their deep integration into the American imperialism suggests that should a conflict with China move into a more, how shall we say, kinetic phase, that Israel would certainly line right up, with the United States and do essentially whatever they could to facilitate American imperialist actions.
Indeed. And lastly on this issue, there's been this explosion of protests across U.S. campuses with students holding encampments and being met with extreme police repression and physical force, being beaten up, tear gassed, hit with rubber bullets, arrested. And you were a student at Kent State University, which I'm not sure how many people on this show are aware of. And you were a student leader in the Students for Democratic Society. And that was around the time that Kent State University became famous across the country for the Ohio National Guard opening fire on students and killing and injuring several in what amounted to a massacre. And they were protesting war, those students. So as somebody who's been involved in the past in a student uprising against war, against imperialism, and having faced down extreme police repression, I'm just curious your thoughts on what's happened the last few weeks across U.S. campuses.
Well, of course, this has just been such an exciting time and such an inspiring time. Last week I was back in Ohio. I went back to Kent for the 54th anniversary of the events of May 1970, and it was a remarkable experience to be there because, of course, several of us sort of old timers from those days, we like to go back and gather and take part in the commemorative events to keep alive the memory of the lengths to which American imperialism and the American government is willing to go to suppress anyone who seriously challenges the policies and the practices that they're carrying out. The movement against the war in Vietnam, the expansion of the war into Cambodia, Nixon's, bogus secret plan for peace that was really a plan for more war. When thousands and thousands and thousands of students rose up across the country against that, the state revealed its willingness to unleash lethal force to kill people, wound people, intimidate people, and we need to always remember that that's something that the American political elites and the American state is willing to do. And so now, in this present moment, where we see once again tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people rising up on campuses, but also in the streets of their cities. Even in a little town like where I live here in southern New Mexico, we've had demonstrations of hundreds of people, in downtown and on our campus, protesting in solidarity with the people of Palestine. So the state has once again, revealed its willingness. Thank God we haven't had any use of lethal force yet. Mm-hmm. But we've had something like over 2,600 people arrested. We've seen students beaten, dragged down steps. We've seen them, being handcuffed and loaded into these buses and all this. People being charged with felonies, for trespassing on their own campuses. This is, it's just as absurd as it was, 50 plus years ago. And what we have is at least the beginnings of a mass movement in solidarity with the people of Palestine, but also exposing the workings of American imperialism overseas and within our own country. So I think that hats off to all these young people who are standing up for what they believe in, standing up for what they think is right, standing up in solidarity with the people of Palestine. Hats off to them, and shame, shame, shame on the academic authorities, on the police departments, on the national politicians who get up and say, oh, we should send in the National Guard. Yeah, that worked great last time, So I think that it just lays bare the stark contradictions between the people and the elites, between the way that it's not just students, it's many people across the country are just horrified by what our government is doing and abetting in Gaza and the occupied territories. And when people stand up, when people rise up to oppose that and say this is wrong, it's got to stop, well, we see what the response of the state is. It's repression, it's intimidation, and I'm inspired by these young people, and I hope and I believe that they'll carry on this struggle and do everything that we can do to support and express our solidarity with Palestine.
Indeed, it's super impressive. And one thing that I also have been impressed about is the way that, I've visited a few of these encampments in different parts of the country. And it's obviously centered around the genocide in Gaza and on Palestine, but there's also an anti-imperialist element to it where people are understanding or beginning to understand or get informed about all of the horrors the U.S. has committed around the world. And so this is a good part to segue into what the U.S. is doing when it comes to China. And I want to start with, the idea of manifest destiny. And, when we think of manifest destiny, it's usually referring to settler colonialism across the Americas, North America specifically. But this also has extended to the Pacific. And I want to quote then National Security Director Robert O'Brien back in 2020. He said, the United States is and has always been an Indo-Pacific nation. A free and open Indo-Pacific depends on robust American leadership. So I want to use that to ask you can you talk about the history of U.S. Pacific expansionism? And, here, what comes to mind off the top of my head is like the annexation of Hawaii, which when I was growing up, I never understood how far Hawaii was from the U.S., like from the U.S. mainland. Because on the map, it just shows like the U.S. mainland, or, and then it just shows like Hawaii in a little box.
Yeah, exactly.
Alaska, right? So you don't really get the idea of just how far away this island is, or this collection of islands is. Hawaii comes to mind. The Philippines come to mind. But I'm curious if you can maybe give us a brief history of the U.S. expansion across the Pacific.
Sure. Basically, you invoke the term manifest destiny, and for the 19th century, what that basically amounts to is the steady encroachment of American settler colonialism across the country. I mean, I live here in New Mexico. This territory was acquired by military force from Mexico in 1848. We know the Louisiana Purchase, the California Gold Rush, all these kinds of things. These were all phases in which basically European Anglo, basically settlers spreading west across the continent. And that comes to an end, really, by the 1890s. And it's fascinating. The American historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, has this article about how after 1890, the frontier was closed, that basically the 48 states, or what becomes the 48 states, that territory was getting filled up now. And so that brings American expansionism to the Pacific, to the coast of the Pacific. And yet, even before the 1890s, there had already been some initial efforts to reach out into the Pacific. The United States purchases Alaska in the 1860s from Russia. We start looking at some of the little islands out in the Pacific. We are involved in Hawaii with a little bit of rivalry with British imperialism there. But, in 1895, the monarchy in Hawaii is overthrown. The United States Marines go in, and we forcibly annex what had been an independent kingdom. 1898, we have the war with Spain. In the Philippines, the Philippine people rise up for their own independence. The United States manipulates that situation and then replaces Spanish colonialism with American colonialism, and wage a war for almost 10 years until 1907, 1908, in which almost 1 out of every 7 Filipinos is killed, either in fighting or from disease or from these concentration camps that they put people in. It was a horrific suppression of Philippine independence, and the Philippines remains an American colony until down after World War II. So the U.S. has had this thrust out into the Pacific to in many ways to gain access to China. Back in those days, American merchants were involved in the opium trade. We had a presence in the treaty ports in Hong Kong. The United States was the second Western power to sign one of the unequal treaties. The British, of course, 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing. The U.S., 1844, the Treaty of Wangsha. We're right in there. And that rivalry, we have a rivalry with Japan. As Japan opens up and becomes an imperialist power, that leads to the Pacific War and World War II. The thrust of American imperialism out across the Pacific has very, very deep roots. And the idea that has meant that we've created a free and open Indo-Pacific region is just ludicrous. What we've created, what we attempted to create, and for a while did maintain and sustain, was a Pacific Ocean and an East Asia and Southeast Asia that was dominated by American imperialism. And now that's changing, and that's of course what's driving this antagonism between the United States and China, is that era of American dominance. What Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in 2011 invoked when she wrote this article in Foreign Policy, calling for a new American Pacific century, right? That idea that the Pacific is, as they sometimes called it, like an American lake. Get real, people. This is not our territory. It doesn't belong to us. We've stolen little bits and pieces, but this is a vast region with billions of people in it, and the idea that the United States has the right to tell everybody there what to do and how to do it. The age when that was even possible to a limited extent is past, and America's got to get over it.
Yeah, it's just so wild, the level of arrogance and entitlement, but that's what you get with a country built on settler colonialism. But, I want to talk about how this is playing out today in the Cold War against China. And one of the front lines that I want to focus on is the South China Sea, which we hear about so much. And I want to introduce this subject through a recent New York Times article. And by recent, I mean, this actually came out just before October 7th. In fact, I initially was going to have you on to talk about this, and we had scheduled it before October 7th, but then we ended up pushing it because Gaza just exploded. But okay, so here's the article. It's from September 23rd of 2023. It's called "Blasting Bullhorns and Water Cannons, Chinese Ships Wall Off the South China Sea." And this is quite the piece. Basically, the piece holds China responsible for militarizing the South China Sea and terrorizing vessels belonging to its neighbors. And I'm just going to quote from this piece, Ken. The New York Times says, "The world's most brazen maritime militarization is gaining muscle in waters through which 1/3 of global ocean trade passes. Here, on underwater reefs that are known as the dangerous ground, the Chinese People Liberation Army, or PLA, has fortified an archipelago of forward operating bases that have branded these waters as China's despite having no international legal grounding. China's Coast Guard, Navy, and fleet of fishing trawlers harnessed into a militia are confronting other vessels, civilian and military alike." So I'm just going to go ahead and ask you to respond to that framing.
Well, it's certainly a framing that it's no surprise that this is articulated in the New York Times, which is basically the paper of record for the American political elites and American imperialism. The South China Sea is a complex geographic region. It's an area in which Chinese mercantile activity, Chinese shipping, and all this has gone on for many, many centuries. Overseas Chinese communities are scattered all around Southeast Asia. The presence of China in the South China Sea. I mean, after all, even in the West, we call it the South China Sea. We don't call it the Southern U.S. Sea. And I think that's there's reasons for that. I think it's very interesting. What gets focused on here is this what's called the 9-dash line, which is on maps that the official maps that the People's Republic puts out. There's this line that shows the areas within which China claims territorial sovereignty, right? One thing that's interesting about that I think never gets noted is that if one were to go to the island of Taiwan and go into a bookstore there and buy a map of the Republic of China, which is what the local authorities on Taiwan claim to be, and of course they claim to be the legitimate government of all of China. What's interesting is that a map of China produced or purchased in Taipei shows exactly the same thing. It has the same 9-dash line because those are historical claims that predate the establishment of the People's Republic. These were claims that were made by the Republic of China, between 1912 and 1949, and they have their origins in the territorial, definitions of the Qing dynasty, the last of the imperial dynasties. There are maps of the Southeast Asian waters. Most famously, one called the Selden map, which is from the 17th century, early 17th century, that's now held in the libraries at Oxford University. That shows these islands and these areas, and it's full of information about navigation in the South China Sea, produced actually by the Chinese overseas community in what is today Indonesia, interestingly enough. So there's a long, long history of China's presence in this area. Now, did the Qing dynasty make the same kind of formal, modern sort of Treaty of Westphalia territorial claims and defining its boundaries? No, because that wasn't the way that international relations in Asia were thought of or were practiced until Western imperialism comes in and imposes its own standards, its own so-called rules-based international order. But as we get to the 20th century, and as I say, with the Republic of China beginning in 1912, these are historical, grounds. This is the basis on which governments, both of the local authorities in Taiwan and of the mainland, these are the claims that they share. If the United States is so gung ho to support the regime on Taiwan, don't they understand that that's the same territorial claims? This is the area that China, whether it's PRC or Taipei, that those governments are making. And I think that's something that the United States needs to pay a little bit more attention to. But this idea that other countries, we understand that Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, countries have their own. They assert their own rights in parts of the South China Sea, and that's fine. Those disputes, those controversies can be resolved through negotiation, through engagement between the various parties to these considerations. And China has made it clear that they're willing to engage in those kinds of discussions. They've done so with Vietnam. The Philippines, of course, as a kind of proxy for American imperialism, has decided to pursue this more assertive role, engaging, interestingly enough, in exactly the same kinds of activities that China is condemned for. The United States backs up the Philippines and says, we're willing to go to war to defend your right to do this. So again, it's this whole complex of kind of double think and double speak, where why is the United States policing this part of the world in the first place? It's just a legacy. It's a lingering aspect of this 19th century, early 20th century American imperialist expansion in the Pacific. And it's something that is, as with the Taiwan situation, it's reckless and dangerous, and yet the United States seems intent upon being as provocative and problematic as it can in that region.
Yeah, and just to tell our viewers, I had you on, I think, a couple of years ago at this point, and we did a whole episode on Taiwan. So I'll actually link to that in the description, and I encourage people to check that out because it was really important just about the history and how we got to where we're at today. But I just want to show to what you're speaking to. Here is the South China Sea. And so there's obviously, if you see this map, this is for those who are just listening, I'm showing a map of the South China Sea. Obviously China's borders on the South China Sea, Vietnam, you have Laos, you have Malaysia, Indonesia, and then of course the Philippines, which, as you were talking about, is basically a proxy of the U.S. in this case. And I show this map, one, so people know where we're talking about, but also I want people to look at this world map and see where America is in relation to the area I was just showing with the South China Sea. It's on the other side of the world, literally. And so to what you're talking to about proxies, I think it's very important because of the fact that, so when we talk about, obviously, this is not where the area of the world where the U.S. is. You mentioned a lot of countries that are there, that this does actually matter to. And there are negotiations China's willing to enter with these countries, as any countries do, over maritime issues. But I want to go back to the New York Times piece. So I'm going to quote from it. It says, While the United States makes no territorial claims to the South China Sea, it maintains defense pacts with Asian partners, including the Philippines, that could compel American soldiers to these waters. So you were speaking a bit to the issue of Philippines working with the U.S. as a proxy here. I think partner here is just another way to say proxy. But that said, how deeply invested in the Philippines in terms of hitting back at China in the South China Sea or militarizing the South China Sea is the U.S. And look, I don't want to sit here and be dunking on the Philippines, but if I was a country like the Philippines, I would see what the U.S. has done with Ukraine and willing to throw them under the bus, what the U.S. did with the government it funded in Afghanistan. I would be very hesitant to jump in 100% with the U.S. thinking they're going to come back me up in some war against China if I just do what they want in the South China Sea. But anyways, can you explain a bit of the dynamic taking place between the Philippines and China and where the U.S.'s role is with this issue?
Sure. Well, I mean, the U.S.'s role, I think, is pretty straightforward, which is that they would very much prefer that the Philippines, simply become a subordinate component of their encirclement of China, that the Philippines would line up 100%. The relationship between the Philippines and the U.S., of course, has had a very complex trajectory that, it was an American colony and we did kill all those people over there. And it's only after World War II that the Philippines becomes independent. But even then, there were massive American bases there. It was used during the war in Vietnam as a base of operations. Finally, eventually, Philippine governments asked the Americans to depart. And for a while, there were no American bases. Now, the U.S. is sort of creeping back in. The Philippines, under different administrations, have navigated a complicated relationship with China. There have been times when Philippine leaders have gone to Beijing and met with Chinese leaders, and there have been joint statements issued, and of course there's trade that goes back and forth, tourism, things like that. But at other times, different leaders, or even the same leaders, it changed their minds. The current leader, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., had initially went to China and had some very seemingly very friendly conversations, but then has now cozied up to the United States. I think that the Philippines tries to sort of play both sides in ways that will allow it to maximize, Philippine interests. And that's obviously a somewhat problematic process. And right now, the Philippines are positioning themselves very closely with the United States. So how this is going to go in the future, whether there will be another sort of swing back towards a more China-friendly posture, I think that remains to be seen. But I certainly think that that's a possibility. I think that, the Philippines, their leaders they're not completely irrational people. They're going to look at the situation. China is right there. In terms of the economic future of the planet, China is the rising entity, and I think that the Philippines would be they'd be nuts to try to really totally alienate China. On the other hand, they have this long history with the U.S., and the U.S. is very, very eager to pour resources in ways that will draw other countries closer to them. The U.S. is in some ways kind of in panic mode about Southeast Asia, and so the Philippines is kind of the strongest card that they have to play, that the Americans have to play. But, the Philippine leadership is not going to is unlikely to just completely subordinate itself to American domination. How they're going to pursue that in the future, I think, is something we're going to have to watch very carefully. The South China Sea is it's a dangerous realm right now. The U.S. is being super provocative, and of course, it has other proxies. The Australians, patrol in there as well, in their sort of demented devotion to America, even as Australian politicians are increasingly recognizing that their relationship with China is going to be very important for their own futures. So we're in a transitional era, and I think that if China continues to retain the kind of cool-headed approach to things that they have demonstrated so consistently, that somehow or other will navigate through this. But the United States, as it becomes increasingly desperate and increasingly reckless, is the great danger to peace, not just in the South China Sea, and as we know, in many other parts of the world as well.
Absolutely. And, I just, I want to add to this, something else from the New York Times. When they like to talk about this thing called Pacific primacy, but they try to blame China for it. They said not since the United States embarked on its own campaign of far-flung militarization more than a century ago, leading its armed forces toward a position of Pacific primacy, has the security landscape shifted so significantly. It's just hilarious. It's an amazing way to put the fact that the U.S. has demanded these defense pacts in Asia, just no questioning at all why the U.S. has this massive military presence in Asia, and that alone is an act of belligerence towards China, because it's all about China. But also the idea that the US is sort of the protector of all of these other smaller countries in the region from China. And so here I'm going to read another thing that the New York Times says. It says, frictions in the South China Sea are greatest in places where Southeast Asian countries have defied the Chinese mandate that the waterway, scooped out on Chinese maps with a dashed line, belongs to Beijing. In waters close to Vietnam and Malaysia, Chinese vessels have disrupted attempts to explore and develop oil and natural gas fields. The Chinese Coast Guard has forcibly prevented its Indonesian counterpart from arresting Chinese fishermen operating well within Indonesian waters. So it basically tries to frame everything China's doing in the South China Sea as super aggressive, super a militarized response to its small, weak neighbors that need America to come and protect it. When, if you actually, logic would say, even if you hate China, if you're going to look at this logically, if the imperialist empire of the US is coming and militarizing the sea next to you, the water next to you, you're going to react. So I'm just curious if you can respond to those claims that China is just this belligerent actor in the South China Sea, preventing its neighbors from exploring their oil and from, arresting Chinese fishermen, whatever that means. I was a little confused by that.
Yeah. Well, again, these other countries have their own claims, their own assertions. The degree to which, the distance to which a country claims territorial waters is something that, the United States claims a 200-mile territorial waters, but it only recognizes other countries' claims to 12 miles of territory.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's wild.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And so, in the case of Indonesia, there are conflicting opinions between Indonesia and China as to what are Indonesian territorial waters. So if Chinese fishermen are in waters which Indonesia claims, but China doesn't recognize those claims, well, that's a matter of dispute. And again, that's something that needs to be resolved by the concerned parties without the interference of outside forces. Just imagine if if in the Caribbean there was an island and a country from outside of this area, not the United States, decided, that it was going to install missiles on that island. What would the reaction of the United States be? Well, we see when we talk about Cuba and the Soviet Union and the 1962 crisis that the United States was willing to risk global nuclear annihilation to maintain its hegemonic posture over the Caribbean, right? Imagine today if China was sending its naval fleet to patrol the Caribbean in the name of preserving the openness of international commerce. The United States would go completely insane, right? We're already pretty insane, but it would just the New York Times would just be beside itself, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
But the U.S. just claims that it has the right to go everywhere in the world, not just the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, the Pacific, everywhere, and just tell everybody what to do and how to do it. And if you're not with us, you're against us. And we just have this amazing, arrogant, zero-sum mentality about how, the world belongs to American capitalism and American imperialism. So, yes, there are these conflicts, and yes, China is a country. It's not some abstract ideological construct, and they have interests. They have national interests, and one thing that they're very concerned about is keeping the South China Sea open for international navigation. China gets a lot of, it gets goods in, it gets oil, for example, in, it ships goods out all over the world. They don't want the South China Sea to be a place where the United States can choke off the commerce that is so important for China's economic development and the future of the Chinese people. So, of course, they're asserting their claims over this territory. And the United States has no business being there in the first place. But the reality is, the United States is there. We have all these military bases. Our naval vessels sail up and down, confronting Chinese ships. Talk about confrontations, these ideas that we're gonna sail into the waters that China claims intentionally under this so-called freedom of navigation. Well, apparently it's freedom of navigation for us, but not for other people, not for other countries. So all of these little confrontations that do take place, yes, these are real things, and these are real issues that need to get resolved. But they don't need the involvement of the United States. We have no business being there, and we have no right to tell other people how to run their own countries.
Absolutely. And I really think the parallel that you made to the Caribbean is so important. It's like, imagine if China came to Cuba and was like, hey, we're going to help you militarize the Gulf of Mexico against the US. How would the New York Times act about that? If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews.